Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The Wasatch Mountains rise steeply on the eastern edge of the Salt Lake Valley, their jagged white peaks visible from almost anywhere in the basin below. In autumn, when the aspens turn gold and the air carries the first cold bite of coming winter, the mountains look like something painted, too beautiful to be real, too permanent to be troubled by the small dramas of human lives unfolding in their shadow. The suburb of Cottonwood Heights sits at the foot of those mountains, a neighborhood of well-kept homes and family routines, the kind of place where people jog in the mornings and wave to each other across driveways. It is quiet. It is orderly. It looks, from the outside, like a place where nothing terrible could happen. On the morning of September 21st, 2024, something terrible happened. Matthew Johnson, 51 years old, a member of the Utah National Guard's Special Operations Unit, and a man who had dedicated a significant portion of his adult life to serving his country, did not find that morning. He slept, in the bed he shared with the woman he had married, the woman he had built a life with, the woman who was in the process of divorcing him. His body would not be found for months. It may not have been found at all. To understand the weight of Matthew Johnson's disappearance, it helps to understand who he was. He was 51 years old, a man in the middle of his life, not at its end. He was a member of a special operations unit within the Utah National Guard, which meant he had not simply signed up for a part-time soldiering commitment. He had trained hard, served with discipline, and occupied a role that required both physical and psychological resilience. His colleagues would later describe his failure to show up for work as the first signal that something was deeply wrong, because Matthew Johnson was the kind of man who showed up. He had been married to Jennifer Gledhill for years. Together they had 3 children. They had shared a home in Cottonwood Heights, beneath those golden mountains, through the seasons of a life built together. But by the summer of 2024, that life was fracturing. In July of that year, Jennifer filed for divorce. She also filed for a protective order against Matthew, a legal mechanism that, if granted, would have required him to stay away from her. That protective order was denied. The couple, estranged but still legally bound, were navigating the painful and complicated terrain of a marriage coming apart. They were still, it appears, living in proximity. They were still, on the night of September 20th, 2024, under the same roof. That was the last night anyone outside that house would see Matthew Johnson alive. Matthew Johnson was reported missing on September 20th, 2024. The report came from Jennifer Gledhill herself. In those first hours and days, the case was treated as a missing person inquiry. A man had vanished, and his wife had raised the alarm. But the details, even from the start, were unsettling. Witnesses had observed an argument between the couple in the period before Matthew disappeared. His truck, a significant detail, the kind of vehicle a man takes with him when he leaves, was found parked only a couple of blocks from his home. A man who chose to leave would almost certainly take his truck. A man whose truck stayed behind had, in all likelihood, not chosen anything at all. Within days, the missing person case shifted. Investigators began treating it as suspicious. On October 1st, 2024, the Cottonwood Heights Police Department arrested Jennifer Gledhill for investigation of murder. The speed of the arrest, from missing person report to murder charge in less than 2 weeks, reflected the weight of what investigators had already begun to piece together. The Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office, led by Sim Gill, filed 9 felony charges against Gledhill on October 14, 2024. Among them was first-degree murder, the most serious charge available under Utah law. The others included 5 counts of obstruction of justice, 1 count of desecration of a human body, and 1 count of witness tampering. The breadth and specificity of those charges told a story even before the evidence was laid out in open court. Investigators believed they knew not just that Matthew Johnson was dead, but how he had died, what had been done with his body afterward, and that deliberate steps had been taken to hide the truth. Charging documents in criminal cases reveal the bones of a prosecution's theory, the factual framework upon which a trial will eventually be built. The documents filed in the Jennifer Gledhill case were, by that standard, extraordinarily specific. Investigators had developed a confidential informant, someone with direct knowledge of what Gledhill had allegedly told them in private. The informant's account was chilling in its detail. According to the informant, Gledhill had admitted to shooting Matthew Johnson in the head with his own gun while he slept in their shared bed on the night of September 21st, 2024. It was, if the account was accurate, a crime committed in the dark, in silence, against a man who had no warning and no chance. What allegedly happened next was, in some ways, even more remarkable in its cold deliberateness. After shooting her husband, Gledhill is alleged to have placed his body into a rooftop storage container, then slid that container down the stairs of their home and loaded it into the back of their minivan. She then, according to the informant, drove north, away from Cottonwood Heights, away from the Salt Lake Valley, toward the open and sparsely populated landscape of northern Utah. Somewhere along that drive, she dug a hole and buried Matthew Johnson in a shallow grave. Before leaving the house, according to investigators, she tidied the master bedroom. She purchased a new mattress to replace the one that had been on the bed. She smashed Matthew's phone. She moved his truck to a nearby neighborhood to make it appear as though he had walked away under his own power. Then she waited 2 days, until September 20th, the following evening, before reporting him missing. If the prosecution's account is accurate, what unfolded in that Cottonwood Heights home was not a crime of sudden rage. It was a crime of calculation. Every investigation eventually turns toward motive, the question of why. In the Gledhill case, investigators and media reports pointed to a marriage that had been under enormous strain for months before Matthew Johnson disappeared. The divorce filing in July 2024 was the most visible sign of that strain, but it was not the only one. Prosecutors alleged that Gledhill had been having an extramarital affair, and that Matthew had allegedly discovered the relationship. Whether that discovery was the catalyst for what followed, or whether it was simply one thread in a more complicated web of domestic tension, was a question that would ultimately be for a jury to weigh. What added another layer of complexity was the financial picture. A recently unsealed search warrant, obtained by multiple Utah news outlets and reported on by People magazine, revealed that 2 days before Matthew Johnson allegedly died, Jennifer Gledhill sent a text message to her father. The message read, "I need $13,000 by Friday." It was a stark and specific demand, $13,000 by a specific deadline. Her father's response to the request, and whether that money was ever transferred, was part of the broader investigation into the family's possible involvement in what followed. Matthew's parents were already aware of the deteriorating marriage. The protective order Jennifer had sought and failed to obtain reflected a relationship that had become adversarial, perhaps volatile. But in the days and weeks after Matthew vanished, his family was left with something far worse than the ordinary anguish of a broken marriage. They were left not knowing where he was, whether he was alive, and whether they would ever be able to bring him home. After Jennifer Gledhill's arrest, investigators faced a task that is among the most challenging in criminal law: building a murder case without a body. In the United States, such cases, sometimes called no-body homicides, are prosecuted relatively rarely, because the absence of physical remains creates an obvious gap in the evidentiary chain. Without a body, there is no confirmed cause of death, no forensic evidence from the victim themselves, no irrefutable proof that the person is even dead. The Cottonwood Heights Police Department, working alongside the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office, began using digital evidence as their foundation. Cell phone data became critical. On the night Jennifer Gledhill allegedly drove Matthew's body north, her phone pinged towers in a specific geographic corridor. Those pings placed her, and investigators believed Matthew's remains, in the vicinity of Davis County, near the Farmington Bay area and the Davis County Waterfowl Management Area, a flat and marshy stretch of land along the eastern edge of the Great Salt Lake. Search teams fanned out across the area. 70 volunteers and law enforcement personnel covered the ground near Farmington Bay on one particularly intensive search weekend. When that area yielded nothing conclusive, the search expanded northward into Box Elder County, stretching all the way to the Utah-Idaho border, to the small community of Snowville and the open plains beyond. Dogs were brought in. Ground-penetrating technology was used in some areas. The search was relentless, but Matthew Johnson's body was not found. Prosecutors, facing the challenge of a trial without physical remains, turned to every other piece of evidence available to them. Forensic analysis of Gledhill's minivan, a Glock handgun discovered in the course of the investigation, though no weapon has been publicly confirmed as the murder weapon. Cell phone screen captures, call logs, email records, a baggie found in Little Cottonwood Canyon. The case being built was one that would ask a jury to look at the sum total of digital footprints, witness accounts, and circumstantial evidence, and conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Matthew Johnson was dead and that Jennifer Gledhill had killed him. Jennifer Gledhill pleaded not guilty to all 9 charges filed against her. She has consistently maintained that position. Her defense team has worked to challenge the evidence at every stage, filing motions, requesting postponements when new evidence emerged, and pushing back against the prosecution's case wherever possible. Her bail requests have been denied. She has remained in the Salt Lake County Jail since her arrest in October 2024. From behind bars, in an unusual and legally notable move, she wrote a personal letter directly to the judge overseeing her case. A letter the judge addressed openly in a January 2026 pretrial conference. A reminder that even within the formal machinery of criminal procedure, the human being at the center of the case was still present, still seeking to be heard. The trial has been delayed multiple times. Originally scheduled for December 2025, then pushed to June 2026, and then postponed again to December 2026 after new evidence emerged that required additional preparation time. Jury selection is currently set to begin on December 7, 2026, with trial days running through December 16th. The case will be heard in Salt Lake County, before a judge and jury who will be asked to determine what happened in a bedroom in Cottonwood Heights in the early hours of September 21, 2024. Investigators have also turned their attention to Jennifer's parents, who were arrested in October 2024 on suspicion of having helped their daughter after the alleged murder. As of the most recent reporting, formal charges against the parents had not yet been filed, and the district attorney's office indicated that a meeting with investigators was expected to determine next steps. For Matthew Johnson's family, the years since September 2024 have been defined by a particular and devastating kind of grief, the grief of not knowing where he is. His body has not been found. As of June 2026, despite the extensive searches that covered hundreds of miles of Utah terrain, Matthew Johnson's remains have never been recovered. His family cannot bury him. They cannot stand at a grave. They cannot perform any of the rituals that human beings have used for thousands of years to acknowledge the passing of someone they loved and begin, however imperfectly, to heal. His colleagues at the National Guard watched one of their own fail to show up for duty one day and never return. His 3 children, Matthew and Jennifer's children, are growing up in the shadow of a tragedy that the legal system has not yet resolved, the details of which will eventually be laid out in a courtroom in a way that no child should ever have to face about their own parents. The search for Matthew Johnson continues even as the legal process moves forward. Investigators have not closed the case on the location of his remains. The families of victims in no-body homicides have sometimes had to wait years, occasionally decades, for physical confirmation of what they already know in their hearts. The mountains and plains of northern Utah are vast and largely empty. A shallow grave in that landscape can remain hidden through seasons of snow and spring thaw and summer heat and the slow, indifferent passage of time. In December 2026, a jury will be selected in Salt Lake County, Utah. They will be ordinary citizens, neighbors, parents, workers, asked to step into one of the most challenging and consequential roles a democracy asks of its people. They will hear weeks of evidence. They will be presented with digital records and forensic analysis and the testimony of a confidential informant who claims to have heard, from Jennifer Gledhill's own lips, an account of what happened that night. They will have to decide, without a body and without a confirmed murder weapon, whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard is high, as it should be. The stakes are enormous, as they always are when a human life, and the question of justice for that life, hangs in the balance. Matthew Johnson was 51 years old. He was a soldier, a father, a man who showed up for his country, for his unit, for his commitments. He spent his career in service, training and preparing for threats that come from the outside, from declared adversaries, from the kind of danger that a special operations unit is built to face. He could not have prepared for what allegedly waited for him in his own home, in his own bed, in the silence of a September night in the mountains of Utah. His name is Matthew Johnson. He deserves to be found. He deserves to be brought home. And in December 2026, a court will attempt to deliver the only piece of justice that remains available to him now: the acknowledgement, in law and in public record, of what the evidence says was done to him, and by whom, and why it must be answered for. The mountains are still there, rising above Cottonwood Heights, golden autumn, white in winter, unchanged. Somewhere beneath the vast Utah sky, in ground that has not yet yielded its secret, a man is waiting to be found. The search goes on. Story 2. Sierra Nicole Locklear was born on January 10, 1991 in Georgia, where red clay earth meets pine forests and small towns hold tight to family traditions. She grew up dreaming of Atlanta, of practicing law in the gleaming towers of Georgia's capital city, of building a career that would make her parents proud. Her mother Kelly remembered her daughter as a fighter from the beginning, someone who had overcome health challenges in her youth and emerged stronger, more determined. Sierra decided early that she would become a lawyer, and once she set her mind to something, nothing could deter her from that path. She moved to Tennessee for her undergraduate studies, then continued to Florida State University for law school, where she specialized in insurance defense. By her early 30s, Sierra had achieved what she set out to do. She was a licensed attorney working for Gordon Rees Scully Mansukhani, an AmLaw 100 firm with more than 1,800 lawyers practicing across all 50 states. She was a devoted aunt to her niece and nephew, taking them shopping for Christmas presents and back-to-school supplies, always present for the people she loved. Sierra maintained an exceptionally close relationship with her parents, particularly her father Nick. They would talk for hours each day, sometimes 5 or 6 hours, discussing their lives, their days, their thoughts about everything and nothing. Her mother Kelly described Sierra as happy, energetic, and loving, someone who brought light into the lives of everyone around her. Her father Nick said she was very outgoing, loved sports and movies, and was really fun to be around. That was the Sierra her family knew and loved. But Nick added something else to that description, something that would prove to be a terrible foreshadowing. And she was really fun, until about a year ago. That was when Sierra met Xavier Breland. The exact circumstances of how Sierra and Xavier met remain unclear, with some reports suggesting they connected on the dating app Tinder, while others claim Sierra was representing Xavier on some legal matters. What is certain is that they met during the pandemic year of 2020, and their romance developed quickly, intensely, with the kind of passion that can sometimes blind people to warning signs they might otherwise notice. She was bubbling over with love, Kelly remembered. They were inseparable. Nick, who had always been protective of his daughter when it came to the men she dated, initially felt that Xavier treated Sierra like a queen. The relationship moved at a breathtaking pace, as whirlwind romances often do, each milestone rushing toward the next without pause for reflection. But Xavier Breland came with a complicated past. He had been married before, and had at least one child from previous relationships, including a daughter. In 2005, he had been convicted of felony burglary charges. Court records indicated he had previous warrants associated with harassing phone calls and violating a family violence order. In 2007, he had been arrested in Florida and extradited to Indiana on a fugitive warrant. These were significant red flags, patterns of behavior that suggested Xavier had difficulty respecting boundaries and following the law. Sierra's cousin Shelby Campbell later revealed that there had been problems in the relationship from the very beginning, problems that Sierra had confided to her in private messages. Early in their dating relationship, something had happened that scared Sierra enough to call things off. She had been hanging out with a male friend at her apartment when Xavier showed up uninvited and sat outside watching. He began sending her threatening texts about spending time with another man. It was controlling behavior, possessive behavior, the kind of jealousy that crosses the line into something dangerous. Despite these warning signs, Sierra became pregnant in April 2021. Shortly after learning about the pregnancy, she and Xavier were married by a justice of the peace via Zoom. The couple relocated to Carmel, Indiana, where Xavier's father lived, and Sierra secured a position at the Indianapolis office of Gordon Rees. Their son Jackson was born in October 2021. By the time Jackson arrived, Sierra's family could see that something was terribly wrong. The vibrant, energetic woman they knew had changed. She looked haggard, run down, afraid. When Sierra and Xavier visited her parents for Christmas in December 2021, they both appeared exhausted and told a bizarre story that immediately alarmed the family. Xavier claimed that people were chasing them, specifically that his ex-wife's new husband was somehow connected to a drug cartel and was trying to harm them. He said they had been hiding in hotels to stay safe. The story made no logical sense, but Sierra seemed to believe it, or at least Xavier had convinced her to believe it. She feared for her life. She lost weight, Kelly said. "This is not Sierra. This is not my daughter." Kelly believed that Xavier was manipulating Sierra, keeping her in a paranoid and afraid state for his own purposes, a classic tactic of abusive partners who use fear to maintain control. Sarah, Sierra's sister, even contacted the FBI about the cartel story, desperate to protect her sister. The authorities investigated and determined there was no validity to Xavier's claims. It had all been a lie, a fiction designed to isolate Sierra and make her dependent on Xavier for protection from a threat that didn't exist. Shelby Campbell knew that the situation was even worse than it appeared. Sierra had sent her photographs of injuries she had sustained during physical altercations with Xavier, saving them in case they were needed for future court proceedings. Sierra had also told Shelby that Xavier had choked her on 2 separate occasions until she saw the lights go out, until she thought she was dying. The text between Sierra and Shelby revealed a woman who was trapped and terrified, who knew she needed to leave but couldn't see a safe way out. She did call the police multiple times, Shelby revealed. The police were called to her residence both in Georgia and Indiana multiple times. But by the time officers would arrive, Sierra would have calmed down enough that she would lie for Xavier, protecting him despite what he had done to her. It's a pattern seen countless times in domestic violence cases, where victims feel compelled to protect their abusers out of fear, love, or a combination of both. Sierra confided to Shelby that she couldn't leave Xavier because she couldn't imagine letting their infant son Jackson go with Xavier for visitation. The thought of her baby being alone with a man who had hurt her so badly was unbearable. So she stayed, trapped between her fear of Xavier and her fear of what might happen to Jackson if she left. But Sierra was also planning. She had opened a secret bank account and was slowly saving money, preparing for the day when she could finally escape. She sent Shelby a text message that showed her determination. "I'm done. I'm leaving. I don't want this anymore." She told her parents that she wanted to move back to Georgia, that she would tell Xavier they were visiting family, but she would never return to Indiana. I encouraged her, and her father encouraged her to come home, Kelly said. We just wanted her to be out of the situation, but Sierra was 31 years old. I trusted her to know what to do. In mid-February 2022, Xavier and Sierra packed up their white Volkswagen Tiguan with their 5-month-old son Jackson and their golden doodle Baker, and they began the 8.5-hour drive from Carmel, Indiana to Georgia. They arrived at Sierra's parents' home on Saturday, February 19, 2022. She came Saturday night and stayed till Sunday, Nick told Dateline. The visit was brief, just one night, before the family moved on to visit Xavier's mother in Johns Creek, Georgia, about an hour's drive away. On Monday, February 21st, at 11:17 p.m., Sierra texted her father saying she would be back in the morning if that was okay. Nick responded immediately, "Of course it's okay, you don't have to ask." But Sierra never came back that morning. On Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022, surveillance cameras captured the last confirmed sighting of Sierra Breland. At 7:17 p.m., she was standing in the doorway of Xavier's mother's home on Highgate Manor Court in the Parsons Walk subdivision of Johns Creek. The footage showed her accepting a delivery, a mundane moment that would become the last verified evidence that Sierra was alive. Nick texted Sierra that evening. She responded saying she was okay, but feeling a little sick. He reached out again later that night asking how she was feeling. This time, there was no response. He texted again on Thursday, February 24th. Again, silence. By Friday, February 25th, 2022, Sierra's parents were becoming genuinely concerned. It was completely out of character for their daughter not to respond to their messages, especially given how close they were, how frequently they communicated. On Saturday morning, February 26th, 2022, Nick's phone rang from an unknown Indiana number. I didn't automatically panic because I thought they were still in Georgia, Nick later told Dateline. So I answered it, and they said it was the police. And that's when they told me she was missing. Xavier Breland had reported Sierra missing from their home in Carmel, Indiana. He claimed that they had returned there together after visiting his mother in Johns Creek. But surveillance footage told a different story. Cameras captured Xavier at gas stations on the drive back to Indiana, going into stores, purchasing items, getting back in the vehicle. At no point in any of that footage were Sierra, baby Jackson, or their dog Baker visible. Xavier told the Carmel Police Department that he and Sierra had argued on the night of February 25th. He claimed she had run out of her Adderall medication and asked for some of his. He said he refused, which made her angry, and she stormed out of the house around 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., wearing a black top and purple shorts. He suggested she might have been walking to a nearby CVS pharmacy. The story was absurd on its face. The temperature that night was 20 degrees Fahrenheit, well below freezing. Sierra had allegedly left without her 3 cell phones, her personal phone, her work phone, and a burner phone that family members said she kept specifically for emergency communication. She had left without her identification, without her credit cards, without her car keys. Most importantly, she had left without her 5-month-old son Jackson, and without Baker, her beloved dog. No one believes Xavier's story that she walked off without her phone, her keys, her baby or her dog, Shelby said. It was 20 degrees out. It is beyond believability. Nick called Xavier directly, trying to get answers, trying to understand what had happened to his daughter. I got nowhere, Nick said. He then called Xavier's father, who lived next door to the couple in Carmel. The response was chilling in its simplicity. He said, "No. I never saw her," Nick recalled. Xavier's father had never seen Sierra return to Indiana at all. Police checked the CVS Xavier claimed Sierra might have walked to. She had never arrived. No surveillance footage captured her entering the store or walking anywhere near it. Family members were informed that there was no evidence Sierra had ever been in Indiana on February 25th or 26th. As investigators from both the Carmel Police Department in Indiana and the Johns Creek Police Department in Georgia began working together, They determined that the last confirmed sighting of Sierra was at 7:17 p.m. on February 24, 2022, at Xavier's mother's home in Johns Creek. Whatever had happened to Sierra had happened in Georgia, not in Indiana, as Xavier claimed. A search warrant was executed at the Highgate Manor Court residence. Forensic experts and cadaver dogs searched the property, looking for blood stains, signs of a struggle, any clues that might reveal what had happened during the couple's stay. Evidence was collected, though investigators did not disclose publicly what they had found. The cadaver dogs did not pick up a strong scent trail at the residence, which complicated the investigation. Investigators also examined the white Volkswagen Tiguan that Xavier claimed he and Sierra had both traveled in back to Indiana. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sniff the vehicle. The results were telling. Those dogs which are very good weren't picking up any scent, nothing, Nick said. If she rode up there 10 hours in that car, the dogs would have known it. The evidence strongly suggested that Sierra had never been in that vehicle on the return trip to Indiana, that Xavier had driven back alone. On February 28, 2022, just 2 days after reporting Sierra missing, Xavier was involved in an incident at his Carmel home involving a firearm. Court documents described it as an accidental discharge of a firearm. Xavier told investigators he was moving a Christmas tree in the garage when he heard a gunshot and ran outside. He said he then returned to the garage, located the gun, and unloaded it. Investigators found a SIG Sauer P365 and another firearm at the scene. During the officers' visit to the home regarding the firearms incident, Xavier handed them a missing persons flyer for his wife. The timing was suspicious, the circumstances bizarre. Just 2 days after reporting that his wife had walked away into the freezing night, Xavier was involved in an unexplained shooting incident at their home. On March 2, 2022, the Carmel Police Department and the Johns Creek Police Department issued a joint press release announcing that Sierra Breland Jr., age 37, had been identified as a person of interest in Sierra's disappearance. The statement clarified that Xavier had not been criminally charged in relation to Sierra's case, but that he had been arrested on an unrelated warrant out of Georgia. That warrant was for aggravated stalking charges in Coweta County, Georgia. Court records revealed that Xavier had allegedly placed a GPS tracker inside a stuffed animal belonging to his daughter, with the intention of monitoring the location of the child's mother, Xavier's ex-wife. The case had stemmed from a custody dispute between the former couple. Xavier was considered a flight risk on the stalking charge because he had previously missed court dates and fled the country. He was extradited to Georgia to face those charges. As the investigation continued, Xavier's accounts of what happened to Sierra kept changing. In March 2022, investigators obtained jailhouse video footage that showed Xavier talking to his children about Sierra's disappearance. In the video, Xavier told his kids that Sierra would not be coming home because someone had kidnapped her. This narrative directly contradicted what he had told the Carmel police, that she had walked away from their home on her own. Xavier's own father acknowledged the inconsistencies in his son's statements. He just creates a different story for everybody he's talking to, Xavier's father admitted. To the police, Sierra had walked away. To his children, she had been kidnapped. To anyone who would listen, Xavier told a version of events that suited his needs in that moment, with no concern for how the stories contradicted each other. The FBI and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation joined the search for Sierra. On March 11, 2022, family members, friends, volunteers, and officers conducted a large search effort in Johns Creek, distributing flyers and searching neighborhoods along Medlock Bridge Road where investigators believed Sierra may have traveled. Digital message signs were placed throughout the area asking for the public's help. Despite the extensive efforts, Sierra remained missing. In August 2022, Xavier went to trial in Georgia on the aggravated stalking charges related to tracking his ex-wife. On August 16, 2022, a jury acquitted him of those charges, and he was released from custody. However, his freedom was short-lived. The following day, he was arrested on a new warrant. Xavier Breland was eventually charged with unlawful possession of a firearm by a serious violent felon in connection with the February 28, 2022, shooting incident at his Carmel home. Because of his 2005 felony burglary conviction in Marion County, Xavier was prohibited from possessing firearms. The trial for this charge was delayed multiple times over the next 2 years. In June 2024, while Xavier's firearm trial was ongoing, he was charged with intimidation. According to court documents and witness testimony, Xavier had made a threatening statement to Blair Duncan, an advocate for Sierra's family who had been attending the trial. As Duncan was exiting the courtroom, Xavier made direct eye contact with her, then turned away and said, "You better hope you see me before I see you." When Duncan walked past him to leave, she noticed that Xavier had seen the lock screen photo on her phone, which showed a child. Xavier commented, "Cute kid," but not in a kind way. No, it was in a threatening way for sure. "Absolutely," Duncan later said. "I'm really over the audacity that it takes for him to think that he can speak to anyone any way that he wants, and to think that he's above the law. And I'm really glad to see some justice, and really happy to be a part of that justice." Courthouse security cameras had captured the interaction. On June 11, 2024, more than 2 years after Sierra's disappearance, Xavier Breland Jr. was found guilty of unlawful possession of a firearm by a serious violent felon. In July 2024, he was sentenced to 12 years in the Indiana Department of Correction. Xavier is currently incarcerated at a facility in Pendleton, Indiana, and is appealing his sentence. Sierra Breland has now been missing for more than 3 years. She was 31 years old when she vanished, standing just 5 feet tall and weighing approximately 120 pounds, with blonde hair and a bright smile that her family will never forget. Sierra's parents, Nick and Kelly Locklear, have been granted custody of Jackson, the grandson they are now raising without his mother. Kelly often reflects on the signs they missed, the warnings they didn't fully understand until it was too late. "We should have seen the signs," she said. "Lots of things go through your mind when your child is missing, and you have thoughts that a specific person is responsible," Kelly added. The family believes with absolute certainty that Xavier knows what happened to Sierra, that he is the only person who can provide the answers they desperately need. "Losing someone, not knowing how or why, is the absolute worst feeling," said Sierra's Aunt Jeannie Bush. "I can't describe it. None of us can move forward, and there's just this constant pain and heaviness of not knowing." Kelly described her daughter's devotion to baby Jackson in heartbreaking terms. "There is no one since the baby has been born. No one has ever kept that baby for her, like not even for an hour," Kelly said. "She was the sole mother, caregiver, everything to that child." The idea that Sierra would walk away from her infant son, that she would abandon Jackson without her phone, her money, or any means of caring for him, is inconceivable to everyone who knew her. For them to say she just said, "Hey, to heck with it, walking out the door without my child, my car, my phone, my money, nothing, and I'm just gonna hit the road," is absurd, Kelly said. Lieutenant Eric Rogier of the Johns Creek Police Department confirmed in March 2025 that the investigation remains active, though he has no new updates or investigative leads to share with the public. Xavier Breland Jr. remains the sole person of interest in Sierra's disappearance. "It's important to keep this story alive because information from the public is often a way for cold cases to break," Lieutenant Rogier said. "It's important not to forget Sierra Breland's tragic disappearance. I have faith that the truth will come to light at some point. That will be a great day, and we want nothing more than to bring justice to Sierra and provide closure for her family." The FBI has announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to Sierra's whereabouts. Investigators continue to hope that someone who saw the white Volkswagen Tiguan with Georgia license plate 5,869 renminbi and an FSU law school frame around the plate will come forward with information about the time between when Sierra was last seen on February 24, 2022, and when Xavier reported her missing on February 26th. Sierra Breland had overcome so much to build the life she wanted. She had worked her way through undergraduate school and law school, had earned her law license, had landed a position at a prestigious national firm. She had become the lawyer she always dreamed of being. She was a devoted aunt, a loving daughter who spoke to her parents for hours every day, a new mother who was fiercely protective of her infant son. But she had also become trapped in a relationship with a man who controlled her through fear and violence, who isolated her from her support system, who told elaborate lies to keep her dependent on him. She had tried to leave. She had saved money in secret. She had made plans to return to Georgia and never go back to Indiana. She had confided in her cousin that she was done, that she was leaving. Somewhere between 7:17 p.m. on February 24th, 2022, when surveillance cameras captured her at her mother-in-law's door in Johns Creek, and February 26th, 2022, when Xavier reported her missing from Indiana, Sierra Breland disappeared. Her body has never been found. No evidence has emerged to suggest she is alive somewhere, starting over, building a new life. Xavier Breland sits in an Indiana prison, serving 12 years for illegal possession of a firearm, maintaining his innocence regarding his wife's disappearance despite the mountain of inconsistencies and lies that surround his story. He told police Sierra walked away. He told his children she was kidnapped. He told his father different stories than he told investigators. He drove back to Indiana alone, despite claiming Sierra had traveled with him. And somewhere in Georgia, or perhaps somewhere along the route between Johns Creek and Carmel, Sierra Breland rests in a location known only to the person who put her there. Her parents wait for answers that may never come. Her son Jackson grows up without his mother, cared for by grandparents who grieve every day for the daughter they've lost and the grandson who will never know her. Loving woman who deserved so much better than the fate she received. And investigators in Johns Creek continue to hope that someone, somewhere, knows something that will finally bring Sierra home and allow her family to lay her to rest with the dignity and love she deserves. Story 3. The morning sun rose over the Mojave Desert on June 28, 2014, casting long shadows across the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms, California. Inside a modest apartment on the base, 19-year-old Erin Corwin stirred awake earlier than usual. She moved quietly through the small space she shared with her husband, Jonathan Corwin, a young Marine corporal. The apartment still held traces of their Tennessee roots, photographs from their hometown of Oak Ridge, reminders of simpler days when they had been childhood sweethearts who met in the 5th grade. Erin gently woke John sometime between 6 and 7 in the morning, her voice soft with the excitement of the day ahead. She told him she planned to drive out to Joshua Tree National Park to scout hiking trails. Her mother, Lore Hevelin, was scheduled to visit the following week, and Erin wanted to find the perfect paths they could explore together during her stay. It seemed like a thoughtful gesture, the kind of thing that reflected Erin's caring nature. John, accustomed to his wife's independence and her love of the outdoors, thought nothing unusual of the plan. He kissed her goodbye, never imagining it would be the last time he would see his wife alive. Erin climbed into her car and drove away from the military base, heading toward the vast expanse of desert that stretched endlessly beyond 29 Palms. The landscape was unforgiving, a brutal terrain of sand, rock, and scattered vegetation baking under the relentless California sun. It was beautiful in its desolation, but it was also dangerous. Hundreds of abandoned mine shafts dotted the region, remnants of gold mining operations that had ceased decades earlier. These deep holes in the earth, some plunging more than 100 feet into darkness, were scattered across more than 300 rugged acres of desert. As the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, John expected his wife to return. But Erin did not come home. The afternoon faded into evening, and still there was no sign of her. A knot of worry began to form in John's stomach. He tried calling her cell phone, but there was no answer. He waited, hoping she had simply lost track of time or encountered car trouble. But as darkness fell over the desert and his wife remained missing, John's concern transformed into genuine fear. It was not until 24 hours had passed that John finally contacted authorities to report Erin missing. The delay would later strike some as suspicious, but investigators would come to understand that John had been hoping, praying even, that his wife would simply walk through the door with a reasonable explanation. When the Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents arrived to take his statement, John passed a polygraph test without difficulty. Digital evidence quickly confirmed that he had been on the base nearly the entire day his wife disappeared. John Corwin was not responsible for whatever had happened to his wife. But someone was. Special Agent Clifton Randolph Jr. of NCIS took charge of the investigation, and from the beginning, he knew they were facing a monumental challenge. The desert surrounding 29 Palms was enormous, a seemingly endless expanse of emptiness punctuated by more than 1,000 abandoned mine shafts. Finding one young woman in such terrain would be, as Deputy District Attorney Sean Doherty would later describe it, like finding a needle in 1,000 haystacks. The words barely captured the magnitude of the task. The desert was vast beyond comprehension, a whole lot of nothing that could swallow a person without a trace. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately. Helicopters took to the skies, their rotors thundering over the desert as crews scanned the ground below for any sign of Erin or her vehicle. The San Bernardino Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team partnered with NCIS agents, forming a coordinated effort that would span weeks. Volunteers combed through the brutal landscape on foot, their faces burned by the sun, their bodies exhausted by the heat. News crews descended on 29 Palms, broadcasting updates about the missing Marine wife who had vanished without a trace. As investigators dug deeper into Erin's life, they began to uncover secrets that John Corwin never knew existed. Friends and neighbors came forward with information that painted a very different picture of Erin's final days. She had not been planning a simple scouting trip for her mother. She had been planning to meet someone. That someone was Christopher Brandon Lee, a 24-year-old Marine corporal who lived in the same apartment complex as Erin and John. Lee was married to a woman named Nicole, and the couple had a young daughter named Liberty. On the surface, the Lees and the Corwins appeared to be friendly neighbors, two young military families navigating life on a remote desert base. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lay a tangled web of deception and desire. Erin and Christopher had been having an affair. What had begun as friendship between neighbors had evolved into something far more complicated. They exchanged text messages filled with longing and secret meetings. Christopher had even written Erin a love letter, a physical testament to feelings that should never have existed between two married people. The affair had been discovered by Christopher's wife, Nicole, who had found the incriminating text messages on her husband's phone. The discovery had sent shockwaves through both marriages, but the relationship between Erin and Christopher had not ended. Instead, it had taken on a new dimension. Erin had confided in a friend that she believed she was pregnant. The situation was complicated in the worst possible way. She did not know whether her husband John or her lover Christopher was the father. It was a secret that weighed heavily on Erin, a burden that she carried alone in those final days. She had told Christopher about the pregnancy, and he had been forced to confront the reality that his affair might produce consequences that could not be hidden. On July 1st, 2014, 3 days after Erin had last been seen, NCIS agents brought Christopher Lee in for questioning. He arrived at the station cooperative and calm, declining the offer of an attorney. He admitted to having what he called an emotional affair with Erin, but he maintained that on the day she disappeared, he had been alone in the desert near Joshua Tree, hunting coyotes. He claimed he had not seen Erin that day, had no idea where she was, and was just as concerned about her disappearance as everyone else. But Christopher Lee was lying. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered evidence that painted a very different picture. Witnesses came forward with information that contradicted Lee's story. A fellow Marine reported seeing a propane tank in Christopher's vehicle on the morning of June 28th. When asked about it, Christopher had allegedly told the Marine that he planned to blow up a mine shaft. Other neighbors recalled disturbing conversations they had had with Lee in the weeks before Erin disappeared. He had talked about murder frequently, discussing various methods of killing and how one might dispose of a body. One neighbor, Connor Ising, testified that Christopher had specifically mentioned hiding a body in the desert and suggested that burning a body could eliminate evidence. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but Erin herself remained lost in the vast desert. Days stretched into weeks, and the search continued with diminishing hope. The summer heat was unrelenting, and survival in such conditions without water and shelter was impossible. The search shifted from a rescue operation to a recovery mission, though no one wanted to say those words aloud to Erin's family. Then, on August 16, 2014, nearly 2 months after Erin had driven away from her home, searchers made a grim discovery at a remote location in the Dale Group mining district near Joshua Tree. At the bottom of an abandoned mine shaft known as the Rose of Peru mine, approximately 140 feet below the surface, they found human remains. The mine was located in an area so remote and difficult to access that it took nearly 2 hours of slow, bumpy, and dangerous travel to reach it. It was, as one local gold miner who knew the area described it, in the middle of nowhere, in no man's land. The body was that of Erin Corwin. Her remains were recovered from the dark shaft, and the nightmare that her family had been living became horrifyingly real. The autopsy would reveal the brutal truth of what had happened to the young woman. Erin had been strangled to death using a homemade garrote, a makeshift weapon constructed from 2 pieces of rebar and a cord. The garrote had been tightened around her neck for at least 5 minutes, cutting off her air supply until she died. She had then been pushed headfirst down the mine shaft, her body falling more than 100 feet into the darkness. The fall had caused additional injuries, fractures to her left collarbone and left rib that occurred at or near the time of death, and skull fractures that happened post-mortem, likely during the process of dragging or throwing her into the mine. Inside the mine shaft with Erin's body, investigators found other items that would prove crucial to the case. There was a propane tank, evidence of an apparent attempt to ignite a fire that might have destroyed the remains. There was a torch made from a shirt tied around a stick and a Sprite bottle. When forensic technicians tested these items for DNA, they found Christopher Lee's genetic material on the shirt that had been fashioned into a torch. The Sprite bottle, which still had its lid on, contained DNA from both Christopher and Erin. The scientific evidence was damning and undeniable. 2 days after Erin's body was discovered, Christopher Brandon Lee was arrested in Alaska, where he had fled with his family. He was charged with first-degree murder with a special circumstance of lying in wait, an enhancement that indicated premeditation and planning. Lee was extradited back to California to face trial for Erin's murder. Initially, Christopher Lee pleaded not guilty to the charges. His defense team prepared to argue that he was innocent, that the evidence against him was circumstantial, that he had not been involved in Erin's death. But as the prosecution built its case, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Investigators had uncovered internet search history from Christopher's computer showing queries about how to dispose of a body. They had testimony from multiple witnesses about his conversations regarding murder and body disposal. They had the physical evidence from the mine shaft linking him directly to the crime scene. And they had the fact that Christopher had borrowed a propane tank from a horse ranch shortly before Erin's disappearance. When the trial began in October 2016, more than 2 years after Erin's murder, the courtroom in San Bernardino was packed with family members, media, and observers eager to see justice served. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Sean Doherty, presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Christopher Lee's own suspicious behavior. They argued that Lee had meticulously planned Erin's murder over several weeks after learning about her pregnancy. He had researched methods of killing and body disposal. He had scouted remote mine shafts in the desert. He had gathered the tools he would need: the garrote, the propane tank, the materials to start a fire. And then on June 28, 2014, he had lured Erin out to the desert under false pretenses. She believed Christopher was taking her out to the desert for a surprise. She thought he might be planning to propose to her, that he might be ready to leave his wife and start a new life with Aaron and their unborn child. The cruel irony of this belief, that Aaron had driven to her death thinking she was heading toward a new beginning, was almost unbearable to contemplate. Then, in a shocking turn of events that stunned everyone in the courtroom, Christopher Lee took the witness stand in his own defense. It was an unusual move. Most defendants in murder trials do not testify, as it opens them up to cross-examination by the prosecution. But Lee and his defense attorney, David Caloyonides, had apparently decided that Christopher needed to tell his story directly to the jury. What followed was testimony that many observers found rehearsed, emotionless, and deeply disturbing. Lee admitted to having a sexual relationship with Aaron. He admitted that she had told him about the pregnancy and her uncertainty about paternity. He acknowledged writing the love letter to Aaron after his wife had discovered the affair. He admitted picking Aaron up at the location where her car was later found abandoned. But then his testimony took a bizarre turn. Christopher claimed that on the day Aaron disappeared, he had been planning to build a tire fire in a remote mine shaft, though he had not told Aaron about this plan. He testified that he told her he was taking her out for a surprise on what he described as a hunting trip. According to his account, he had thrown various items down the mine shaft: the propane tank, tires, water jugs filled with gasoline, and the makeshift torch, all in preparation for starting this mine fire. While he did this, he claimed, Aaron had simply sat in his Jeep listening to music. Then, Lee testified, when he was unable to start the fire he had planned, he had become so upset that he decided to play Russian roulette with his gun while sitting in the vehicle. This had frightened Aaron, he said, and she had walked away into an adjacent mine shaft. When he was unable to follow through with shooting himself, he called Aaron back from the mine. It was at this point, according to Christopher's testimony, that Aaron made a shocking confession. She told him, he claimed, that she had molested his young daughter, Liberty. This accusation, leveled against a dead woman who could not defend herself, was met with outrage and disbelief by Aaron's family and many observers. Lee testified that upon hearing this alleged confession, a red-hot knife went through his heart, and he lost control. As luck would have it, he said, he just happened to be holding the garrote in his hand at that moment, and in his rage, he strangled Aaron to death before dumping her body down the mine shaft. The testimony was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. Lee appeared to try to cry at one point, making crying sounds, but no tears fell and no tissues were needed. To many watching, including the courtroom reporter who documented the trial, it sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. The defense was attempting to argue that Christopher had not planned to kill Aaron, that her death had been an impulsive act committed in the heat of the moment rather than a premeditated murder. The prosecution tore this defense apart. Sean Doherty pointed out that Christopher had spent weeks researching murder and body disposal. He had gathered specific tools for killing. He had scouted remote locations. He had borrowed a propane tank and brought it to the scene. He had constructed a garrote specifically designed for strangulation. These were not the actions of someone acting impulsively. These were the calculated steps of someone planning a murder. Furthermore, the prosecution argued, Lee's claim about Aaron confessing to child molestation was not only unsupported by any evidence, but it was contradicted by the actions of both Christopher and his wife Nicole. According to Lee's own earlier testimony, Nicole had supposedly seen suspicious irritation on their daughter's genitals and had immediately assumed Aaron was responsible. Yet neither parent had called law enforcement or taken their daughter to a pediatrician. Even more damning, both parents had continued to allow Aaron to babysit Liberty after these supposed suspicions arose. The story made no logical sense, and Doherty characterized it as yet another lie crafted by Christopher Lee to escape responsibility for his crime. The jury deliberated on the evidence, the testimony, and the character of the defendant. They considered the scientific evidence linking Lee to the crime scene. They weighed his constantly changing stories, first claiming he had not seen Aaron that day, then admitting to killing her but claiming it was unplanned. They examined the timeline of his actions and the tools he had brought to the desert. And they thought about Erin Corwin, a 19-year-old woman who had made mistakes in her young life, but who had not deserved to die for them. On November 15, 2016, after just 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait. The swift verdict indicated that the jurors had seen through Lee's testimony and had recognized it for what it was: a desperate attempt to evade responsibility for a carefully planned and brutally executed murder. 2 weeks later, on November 29, 2016, Christopher Brandon Lee returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom was filled once again with Aaron's family members, who had endured more than 2 years of grief and horror. They now had the opportunity to address the man who had taken their daughter, their sister, their loved one from them. Laura Hevelin, Aaron's mother, stood before the court to deliver a victim impact statement. Her voice carried the weight of a mother's unbearable loss as she spoke directly to Christopher Lee. She expressed her inability to understand how anyone could think murder was an acceptable solution to their problems. With devastating simplicity, she pointed out that if Christopher had truly wanted to escape the situation with Aaron, all he had to do was move to Alaska and change his phone number. Instead, he had chosen violence. He had chosen to end a young life and destroy countless others in the process. Christopher Lee was given an opportunity to address the court as well. He claimed that he had taken the stand to tell the truth, acknowledging that he had taken Aaron's life in what he still characterized as an act of rage. But Sean Doherty, the prosecutor who had worked tirelessly to secure justice for Aaron, called Lee's statement nonsense. In an interview, Doherty explained that this was what Christopher Lee did. He crafted lies around the facts of the case, constantly reshaping his story to fit whatever narrative might help him escape the consequences of his actions. The judge delivered the sentence that the jury's verdict had mandated. Christopher Brandon Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again walking free, never again able to hurt anyone else. For Aaron's family, the sentence provided a measure of justice, though it could never restore what had been taken from them. The case of Aaron Corwin is a tragedy that echoes far beyond the desert where she died. It is the story of a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, who made mistakes as all young people do, but who paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong person. It is the story of a community torn apart by secrets and lies, of 2 young families destroyed by infidelity and violence. It is the story of the relentless efforts of law enforcement officers who refused to give up the search, even when the odds seemed impossible, and who worked for years to ensure that justice was served. The abandoned mine shafts of the Mojave Desert still stand, scattered across the vast landscape like dark wounds in the earth. The Rose of Peru mine, where Aaron's body was hidden for nearly 2 months, remains a silent testament to the terrible events that unfolded there on June 28, 2014. For those who knew and loved Aaron Corwin, the desert will forever be haunted by her memory, a reminder of a bright young life extinguished far too soon, and of the evil that sometimes lurks behind the most ordinary faces. Story 4. The city of Milwaukee, a sprawling urban landscape on the western shore of Lake Michigan, was in the final throes of summer in September 2022. The days were still warm, but a crispness in the air hinted at the coming autumn. For 20-year-old Canya Brunson, it was a time of transition, a period of her life filled with the promise of new beginnings and the pursuit of dreams. Her family and friends knew her as a vibrant young woman with a radiant smile that could light up a room. She was the kind of person you wanted in your life, her father, Shante Brunson, would later say, his voice thick with a mixture of love and sorrow. Canya was his everything, a daughter who had taught him so much about himself in her short time on Earth. Canya had ambitions. At one point, she dreamed of becoming an orthodontist or a veterinarian, a testament to her caring nature. Later, discovering a knack for making others look and feel their best, she enrolled in beauty school, channeling her creativity into a new passion. She was on the cusp of adulthood, navigating the complexities of life, love, and her own aspirations. Her mother, Jennifer Meadows, considered Canya her best friend, a bond that was as deep as it was unbreakable. They shared a close relationship, one filled with laughter and the easy comfort that comes from a lifetime of shared experiences. Her stepfather, Cameron Meadows, remembered her infectious laugh and how she could make you smile with the silliest of things. But beneath the surface of this bright and promising life, a dark and complicated relationship was unraveling, one that would ultimately lead to a tragic and brutal end. For several years, since she was a teenager, Canya had been involved in a secret relationship with a man named Sultan Sharif. At 53 years old, Sharif was nearly 3 decades her senior, a married man with a life and a family completely separate from the one he had built with Canya. Their relationship was a clandestine affair, a hidden world of promises and deceptions. It was, as Sharif himself would later concede in a moment of understated self-reflection, a little toxic. The nature of their relationship was a complex web of power dynamics and emotional dependency. Canya, young and perhaps naive, had fallen for the older man. Sharif, a man with an extensive criminal history dating back to 1989, including a 10-year prison sentence for narcotics possession, was a figure who exuded a certain kind of dangerous charm. He was a man accustomed to living outside the rules, a multiple felon who had twice had his probation revoked. At the time of his relationship with Canya, he was under a court order to have no contact with her, a clear sign that their affair had already crossed into dangerous territory. As the summer of 2022 drew to a close, the threads of this secret life began to fray. Sharif, it seemed, wanted out, but ending a relationship that had spanned years and was built on such a fraught foundation was never going to be simple. Canya, for her part, was not ready to let go. The dynamic between them shifted, the toxicity brewing beneath the surface beginning to bubble over. A week before Canya's life was tragically cut short, a strange and ominous event took place. Sultan Sharif contacted Canya's mother, Jennifer Meadows. The conversation was a chilling premonition of the violence to come. He goes on to say, "I want to be done messing with your daughter," Jennifer would later recall, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "But she's reaching out to my wife." This was the turning point. Canya had crossed a line that Sharif was not willing to tolerate. She had brought their secret affair into the light, threatening to expose his double life to his wife. The revelation sent Sharif into a spiral of desperation. The man who had carefully constructed 2 separate worlds was now facing the collapse of both. His desire to end the relationship had morphed into something far more sinister, a need to silence Canya permanently. The morning of September 24th, 2022, dawned like any other Saturday in Milwaukee. But for Canya Brunson, it would be her last. She met with Sultan Sharif that morning, a meeting that would seal her fate. What exactly was said between them in those initial moments remains unknown, but the encounter quickly escalated into a scene of brutal violence. A friend of Sharif's, a witness to the unfolding horror, would later tell police a story that sent a chill down the spine of even the most seasoned investigators. He had seen Sharif in his car, laying on top of Canya. She was screaming, pleading for help, her voice a desperate cry in the morning air. "He cut my throat," she screamed, the words a stark and terrifying testament to the violence being inflicted upon her. The witness, horrified by what he was seeing, dialed 911, his voice trembling as he relayed the gruesome scene. Police were dispatched to the area, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. Sharif and Canya had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a young woman's screams and a chilling sense of dread. Canya was now officially a missing person, her family's worst fears beginning to take shape. "I wasn't even there 30 minutes, and they called and told me her car was found," Jennifer Meadows recounted, the memory of that day forever seared into her mind. "And I knew then, at that point, like something happened to her." Hours later, the second 911 call came in. This time, it was a report of a fire in an alley near Keefe Avenue and Palmer Street on Milwaukee's north side. When the fire department and police arrived, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. In the smoky, charred remains of the fire, they discovered a body. It was Canya Brunson. Her life, so full of promise and potential, had been extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. The investigation that followed painted a grim picture of Canya's final hours. The medical examiner's report revealed the full extent of the savagery she had endured. She had been stabbed and shot, her wrists bound with wire, a detail that spoke to the cold and calculated nature of her killer. And then, in a final desperate act to destroy the evidence of his crime, her murderer had set her body on fire. The gruesome discovery sent shockwaves through the community and left Canya's family utterly devastated. "She was everything to me," Jennifer Meadows said, her voice choked with a grief so profound it was almost palpable. "She was everything, and this is the most hurtful feeling." The investigation into Canya's murder quickly zeroed in on Sultan Sharif. The witnesses' testimony, the history of their volatile relationship, and Sharif's ominous call to Canya's mother all pointed to him as the prime suspect. But the investigation also uncovered a disturbing accomplice. Sharif's brother-in-law, Johnny Hopgood, was charged with mutilating a corpse and harboring or aiding a felon. Police alleged that after Sharif had killed Canya, he had enlisted Hopgood's help to dispose of her body, the two of them working together to set her remains on fire in that lonely Milwaukee alley. The case against Sharif grew stronger as investigators pieced together the events of that fateful day. His wife had initially claimed that he was with her on the night of the murder, a desperate attempt to provide him with an alibi. But video evidence contradicted her story, shattering the web of lies they had tried to weave. Sharif was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide and mutilating a corpse. His bond was set at $500,000, while Hopgood's was set at $50,000. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, but for Canya's family, the road ahead would be long and arduous, a painful journey through the labyrinthine corridors of the legal system. They wanted justice for Canya, and they were determined to see it through to the end. There's some comfort to know that, we have the suspects and, they're being charged, a family member expressed, capturing the complex mix of relief and anxiety that had settled over them. But yet and still with the court system kind of headache pushing stuff back, rescheduling everything. And, that's what keeping, us for not having all the peace we want. They would be in the courtroom for every hearing, every motion, every step of the way, their presence a silent testament to their love for Canya and their unwavering demand for justice. The trial of Sultan Sharif began in December 2023, more than a year after Canya Brunson's brutal murder. The courtroom was filled with a palpable tension, the air thick with grief and anticipation. Canya's family and friends packed the gallery, a sea of white shirts bearing a collage of images of Canya, her smiling face a stark reminder of the life that had been so senselessly stolen. "Our angel, forever in our hearts," the shirts read, a silent tribute to the daughter, granddaughter, and friend they had lost. At the prosecution's table sat Assistant District Attorney Ian F. Vance Curzon, a seasoned prosecutor who had handled his share of high-profile murder cases. He methodically laid out the state's case against Sharif, painting a chilling picture of a man driven by a desperate need to keep his secrets buried. He detailed the years-long affair that began when Canya was just a teenager, the escalating conflict when she threatened to expose him, and the final, brutal act of violence that had ended her life. The evidence was damning. The witness who had heard Canya's screams, the wire that had bound her wrists, the gunshot and stab wounds, and the charred remains found in the alley. Sharif, now 55 years old, sat at the defense table, his face a mask of indifference. When it was his turn to speak, he offered a rambling, self-serving denial, a desperate attempt to deflect blame and rewrite the narrative of his crime. He claimed the jury had gotten it all wrong, that he had nothing to do with Canya's death. He admitted to their toxic relationship, but insisted it had never turned violent. He claimed he was 3 or 4 miles away from where Canya's body was burned, and he even tried to implicate a cousin whose name had never been mentioned during the entire 6-day trial. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, a man who had simply been trying to help a young woman who was down on her luck. "I felt sorry for her to some degree," he said, his voice devoid of any genuine emotion. "But that other stuff? I would never have hurt her. His words rang hollow in the silent courtroom. The jury, a group of 12 ordinary citizens, listened intently to the evidence, their faces grim. They had heard the testimony, seen the photographs, and listened to the chilling details of Canya's last moments. After a 6-day trial, they retired to the deliberation room. They needed only 45 minutes to reach a verdict. The speed of their decision was a testament to the overwhelming evidence against Sharif. The verdict was guilty. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, party to a crime, and mutilating a corpse. A wave of emotion washed over the courtroom. For Canya's family, it was a moment of profound relief, a confirmation that their daughter's life had not been taken in vain. Justice, it seemed, was finally within reach. The sentencing hearing was held in February 2024. It was a day for Canya's family to confront the man who had stolen their daughter from them, to give voice to their pain and their anger. Canya Brunson, Canya's father, he stood before the court, his eyes fixed on Sharif, his voice trembling with a rage that had been simmering for more than a year. He called Sharif a monster, a demon who had savagely ended his daughter's life. "If I go to hell," he shouted, his words a raw and unfiltered expression of his grief, "I'll see you there." Canya's grandmother, Charlene Litzler, remembered her granddaughter as a vibrant young woman with a beautiful smile, who loved going to the state fair with her family. She was on her way to college to make her dreams come true until this demon took her life, she said, her voice filled with a grandmother's love and a profound sense of loss. The defense requested that Sharif be eligible for release on extended supervision after 20 years, a plea for a leniency that felt like a slap in the face to Canya's family. But Milwaukee County Circuit Court Judge David Swanson was not moved. He looked at Sharif, a man with a lengthy criminal history, a man who had shown no remorse for his actions, and he delivered his sentence. Calling Sharif's actions vicious and cruel, he ordered him to serve the rest of his life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The sentence was a final, unequivocal statement that Sultan Sharif would never again have the chance to harm another innocent person. For Canya's family, the life sentence was a form of justice, a final closing of a chapter that had been filled with so much pain and sorrow. "Thank you, Jesus, we got justice life," Charlene Litzler posted on Facebook, her words a simple but powerful expression of their relief. The legal battle was over, but the grief would remain, a constant companion in the years to come. The story of Canya Brunson is a tragic tale of a life cut short, a story of a secret love affair that turned deadly. It is a story about the devastating consequences of deceit and the dark side of human nature. But it is also a story about a family's unwavering love and their relentless pursuit of justice. In the end, Canya's voice was not silenced. It was heard in the testimony of witnesses, in the evidence presented by the prosecution, and most powerfully, in the heartbroken words of her family. Her memory lives on, a reminder of the bright, vibrant young woman she was, and the dreams she never had the chance to fulfill. The city of Milwaukee will remember her, not for the tragedy of her death, but for the light she brought into the world during her all-too-brief time in it. Story 5. The highlands of western Panama rise in emerald layers toward the sky, where cloud forests cling to volcanic slopes and rivers cascade through valleys carved over millennia. In the spring of 2014, the small mountain town of Boquete, nestled in the province of Chiriquí, beckoned to adventurers and volunteers from across the globe with promises of natural beauty, cultural immersion, and meaningful work. For two young Dutch women eager to make a difference in the world, this remote corner of Central America represented the beginning of an adventure that would fulfill their dreams of travel and service. Chris Kremers was 21 years old, a vibrant young woman with blonde hair and an infectious enthusiasm for life. Her friend Lizanne, 22, shared her sense of adventure and her desire to explore beyond the familiar boundaries of their homeland in the Netherlands. The two had been planning this journey for months, carefully arranging a 6-week trip to Panama that would combine tourism with volunteer work teaching local children. They had secured a placement through a Spanish school in Boquete, where they would live with a host family and immerse themselves in the rhythms of Central American life. On March 15th, 2014, Chris and Lizanne boarded a plane in Amsterdam, their backpacks filled with essentials and their hearts brimming with anticipation. They flew first to Costa Rica before making their way south into Panama, a country neither had visited before. For the next 2 weeks, they toured the nation as ordinary travelers, documenting their experiences through photographs and staying in touch with their families through daily text messages that chronicled their adventures in vivid detail. On March 29th, the young women arrived in Boquete, a picturesque town surrounded by coffee plantations and dominated by the imposing presence of Volcan Baru, Panama's highest peak. They moved into the home of Miriam Guerra, a local woman who had agreed to host them during their volunteer stint. The arrangement seemed perfect, a comfortable place to stay in a welcoming community, close to where they would be working with children. But the volunteer placement encountered an unexpected complication. The organization they had arranged to work with informed them that the children's program would not begin until April 4th. The delay left Chris and Lizanne with several days of free time, an opportunity to explore the natural wonders that surrounded Boquete before their work commitments began. April 1st, 2014, dawned as a beautiful day in the Panamanian highlands. The sun illuminated the green mountains, and the cool air of the high altitude made hiking an appealing prospect. Chris and Lizanne decided to explore El Pianista, a well-known trail that began just outside of town near a restaurant bearing the same name. The trail was popular with tourists and locals alike, winding upward through farmland before ascending into the cloud forests that shrouded the Continental Divide, the ridge separating waters flowing to the Pacific Ocean from those destined for the Caribbean Sea. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, Chris and Lizanne's walking toward the trailhead. They appeared relaxed and happy, dressed in casual hiking attire and carrying Lizanne's blue backpack containing essentials for the day: water, snacks, sunglasses, 2 mobile phones, and Lizanne's Canon PowerShot digital camera. The early portion of El Pianista Trail passes through open countryside, following what appears to be a long driveway before transitioning into denser vegetation. For the first 15 minutes, hikers traverse relatively open terrain with spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Then the path enters the forest proper, climbing steadily upward through increasingly humid conditions as elevation gains exceed 2,000 feet over approximately 4 kilometers. Lizanne documented their journey with her camera, capturing images of Chris walking ahead on the trail, both women smiling at scenic overlooks, and the surrounding forest as they climbed higher into the mountains. The photographs from that morning reveal a perfectly ordinary hiking expedition. 2 friends enjoying nature, pausing occasionally to take pictures, moving deeper into the cloud forest with each passing hour. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Lizanne photographed Chris standing on what appeared to be a small wooden crossing over a stream. The image shows Chris looking back toward Liz and her expression neutral, perhaps questioning whether they should continue forward or turn back. This photograph would become one of the most analyzed images in the entire case, for it represents the last daylight picture ever taken of Chris Kremers. What Chris and Lizanne did not fully understand was that they had reached a critical juncture. The trail behind them led back to Boquete, to safety and civilization. The path ahead crossed the Continental Divide and descended into wilderness on the Caribbean side of the mountains, a region of dense jungle, rushing rivers, and treacherous terrain largely uninhabited except for indigenous communities and scattered farms. The trail became less defined beyond this point, deteriorating into muddy paths that required local knowledge to navigate. Many hikers turned back at or before the summit, recognizing that venturing farther required preparation they had not made. For reasons that would forever remain unknown, Chris and Lizanne continued forward past the stream crossing. Perhaps they were curious about what lay ahead. Perhaps they believed the trail would loop back to town. Perhaps they simply underestimated the challenges that awaited them on the far side of the divide. No further photographs were taken in daylight that day. The camera fell silent, and so did any clear record of what transpired in the hours that followed. That evening, when Chris and Lizanne failed to return to Miriam Guerra's home, their host noticed their absence, but did not immediately raise an alarm. Young travelers often changed their plans spontaneously, staying out late or spending nights with new friends. It was not until the following morning, April 2nd, when the women missed a scheduled appointment with a local guide, that concern began to crystallize. The guide's dog had reportedly returned home alone the previous night, a detail that struck some as ominous. More troubling was the sudden cessation of daily text messages that both women had been faithfully sending to their parents in the Netherlands. The communication that had been so reliable throughout their journey simply stopped after April 1st. By April 6th, alarm had transformed into full-scale crisis. The parents of both young women flew from the Netherlands to Panama, accompanied by Dutch police detectives and dog-tracking units. They joined Panamanian authorities in launching an intensive search of the forests surrounding El Pianista Trail. The families offered a reward of $30,000 for any information leading to the whereabouts of Chris and Lizanne. For 10 days, search teams combed the mountains. Aircraft flew overhead scanning for any sign of the missing women. Volunteers from Bouquet joined professional searchers in traversing the difficult terrain. They called out the women's names, hoping for a response from somewhere in the dense vegetation. But the jungle, vast and indifferent, yielded nothing. No trace of Chris or Liz and emerged despite the hundreds of person-hours devoted to finding them. The initial search was eventually scaled back, though authorities continued periodic efforts to locate the missing women. Theories proliferated in the absence of evidence. Some suggested the women had gotten lost and perished from exposure or injuries sustained in a fall. Others whispered about criminal involvement, pointing to robberies that had occasionally occurred in the area. Without evidence to support any particular scenario, speculation filled the void. Then, on June 14, 2014, more than 10 weeks after Chris and Lizanne had vanished, a woman from the indigenous village of Alto Romero discovered something extraordinary along the banks of a river on the Caribbean side of the Continental Divide. Partially submerged in the water, wedged between rocks, was a blue backpack. The woman retrieved it and soon realized it contained items that did not belong in the jungle. A Canon camera, 2 mobile phones, $90 in cash, 2 pairs of sunglasses, 2 bras, a water bottle, and a passport belonging to Lizanne Frun. The discovery electrified the investigation. The backpack had been found far from El Pianista Trail, in an area that would have required many kilometers of extremely difficult travel through dense jungle to reach. Remarkably, despite having been in the humid tropical environment for over 2 months, the items inside the backpack appeared to be in relatively good condition, protected by the bag's water-resistant construction. Authorities immediately focused on the electronic devices. The 2 phones, one belonging to Chris and the other to Lizanne, contained logs that revealed a harrowing timeline of desperation. On April 1st, just hours after the last photograph was taken, both phones showed evidence of attempted emergency calls. At approximately 4:39 in the afternoon, someone tried to dial 112, the European emergency number. When that failed, they attempted 911. Neither call connected, likely due to the lack of mobile signal in the remote mountainous region. The phones were powered on repeatedly over the following days. April 2nd saw multiple attempts to call emergency services, all unsuccessful. The pattern continued on April 3rd and 4th, with the phones being switched on to check for signal before being powered down again to conserve battery life. By April 6th, the attempts became less frequent. On April 11th, Chris's phone was powered on for the final time. Someone attempted to enter the PIN code, but inputted incorrectly. The device never activated again. What made the phone data particularly haunting was what it revealed about the circumstances. The systematic powering on and off of the devices suggested conscious, deliberate action by someone trying to preserve battery, while repeatedly checking for signal. The incorrect PIN entry on the final day raised questions. Had Chris, the phone's owner, been unable to enter her own code? Or had Lizanne, potentially unfamiliar with the pin, tried to activate her friend's phone in desperation? The Canon camera contained even more disturbing evidence. When investigators examined the memory card, they found photographs that documented a journey into nightmare. The images could be divided into two distinct groups: the daytime photographs taken during the hike on April 1st, and a series of 90 flash photographs taken in complete darkness during the early morning hours of April 8th, 7 days after the women disappeared. The night photographs defied easy interpretation. Taken between 1 and 4 in the morning, they showed glimpses of jungle vegetation, rocks, tree branches, and occasionally what appeared to be plastic bags or markers. Some images captured what looked like the back of Lizanne's head, her reddish-brown hair visible against the darkness. Others showed seemingly random sections of forest floor, illuminated only by the camera's flash. One particularly analyzed photograph appeared to show a tangle of tree branches against the night sky, arranged in what some observers interpreted as markers or signals. The photographs raised more questions than they answered. Why had the women waited 7 full days before taking these nighttime images? Were they attempting to illuminate their surroundings to find a way out, or were they trying to create visible signals for potential rescuers? Why were no photographs taken during the intervening 6 days, and why did the photographic sequence end after that single night? More troubling still was a mystery that emerged from careful examination of the photograph numbering. Between the last daylight image, numbered 508, and the first nighttime photograph, which should have been numbered 509, there was a gap. Image 509 had been deleted from the camera, removed at some point between April 1st and April 8th. What that missing photograph depicted, and why it had been erased, became one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. In the days following the backpack's discovery, authorities intensified their search of the area where it had been found. On June 19th, a pelvic bone was discovered along the same river system. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Liz and Frun. Over the following weeks, additional remains emerged: a foot still inside a boot belonging to Liz and scattered bones that DNA analysis matched to Chris Kremmer's. The remains were fragmentary and scattered across a considerable distance, spread by water flow or other forces across the difficult terrain. On June 24, 2014, the families of Chris Kremers and Liz and Frun received official confirmation of what they had feared for months. Their daughters were dead. Forensic analysis had positively identified remains belonging to both women, ending any hope of finding them alive. Yet the discovery of remains did not bring clarity. The bones that were found represented only a small fraction of 2 complete skeletons. No skulls were recovered. No major bones that might have revealed cause of death. The fragmentary nature of the remains and their dispersed locations prevented pathologists from determining how the women had died. There were no clear signs of trauma that could be definitively interpreted, no evidence of foul play that could be conclusively proven, but also no evidence that could rule it out. The condition of some bones raised additional questions. Observers noted that certain remains attributed to Chris appeared unusually bleached, their color suggesting exposure to chemicals or environmental conditions that differed from other recovered bones. The significance of this observation remained unclear, though it fueled speculation about tampering or unusual post-mortem circumstances. The official conclusion, eventually reached by Panamanian authorities, suggested that Chris and Lizanne had become lost after crossing the Continental Divide, perhaps disoriented after leaving the defined trail. They had attempted to call for help, but found themselves beyond the reach of mobile signals. They had survived for several days in the jungle before succumbing to injuries, exposure, or dehydration. Their remains had then been scattered by natural forces: animals, water flow, and decomposition. This explanation satisfied some observers who viewed the case through the lens of tragic misadventure. The jungle was unforgiving, and even experienced hikers could become fatally lost in such terrain. A fall, an injury, a wrong turn could transform a pleasant day hike into a death sentence. The phone logs demonstrated the women's desperate attempts to summon help. The nighttime photographs suggested they had survived for days, trying to signal rescuers or illuminate their surroundings. But others found the official conclusion insufficient to explain the accumulation of strange details. The missing photograph, numbered 509, remained unexplained. The 7-day gap between the last daylight image and the nighttime photography session seemed inconsistent with the pattern of phone usage, which showed daily attempts to call for help. The condition and location of the backpack raised questions about how it had arrived where it was found, relatively intact after more than 2 months in a harsh environment. The investigation itself became controversial. Critics pointed to what they viewed as inadequacies in the authorities' response. The initial reluctance to take the disappearance seriously, the failure to properly secure potential evidence, the incomplete forensic examination of the recovered items. Prosecutor Zeta Pitti, who oversaw the case, faced accusations of premature conclusions and insufficient thoroughness, though she maintained that the evidence supported the lost and perished theory. The guide who was supposed to meet with the women on April 2nd became a subject of interest for some independent investigators, particularly after it emerged that his family members were involved in finding the backpack. However, no evidence ever emerged linking him or anyone else to criminal involvement in the women's disappearance. For the families of Chris Kremers and Lizanne, the ambiguities surrounding their daughters' deaths compounded their grief. They had sent vibrant, capable young women to Panama full of hope and idealism, expecting them to return enriched by their experiences. Instead, they received fragmented remains and incomplete answers, a mystery that defied resolution despite extensive investigation. The El Pianista Trail itself has become simultaneously famous and infamous. Hiking guides now prominently warn visitors not to venture beyond the Continental Divide without proper preparation and local expertise. The case of Chris and Liz serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating wilderness terrain, about the thin line between adventure and disaster. What remains undisputed is the tragedy of 2 lives cut short at their beginning. Chris Kremers, who at 21 should have had decades ahead to pursue her dreams and build a life. Lizanne, 22 years old, whose desire to volunteer and help children reflected a generous spirit that deserved to flourish. They traveled to Panama with the best intentions, seeking to contribute positively while experiencing a different culture. In the end, the case of Chris Kremers and Lizanne resists simple categorization. It stands as either a tragic example of how quickly nature can turn deadly for the unprepared, or as an unsolved mystery suggesting darker possibilities that evidence cannot definitively prove or disprove. The truth, whatever it may be, remains hidden in the forests of western Panama, lost somewhere between the last smile captured in daylight and the desperate flash photographs illuminating the darkness of an April night in 2014. Story 6. The summer heat of December in Argentina hung heavy over the small city of Gualeguaychú, a place of approximately 100,000 residents nestled in Entre Rios province, about 200 kilometers north of Buenos Aires. The city, known for its carnival celebrations and positioned along the Gualeguaychú River, was the kind of community where families knew each other, where young people grew up together, and where tragedy felt particularly intimate when it struck. In late December 2017, as residents prepared to celebrate the new year and enjoyed the long summer days, 2 young people were navigating the complicated terrain of a relationship that had been both passionate and turbulent. Fernando Gabriel Pastorzo was 20 years old, born on January 3, 1997. He was a student with his whole life stretching before him, living in the Tomás de Rocamora neighborhood of Gualeguaychú with his family. Those who knew Fernando described him as a young man engaged in his studies and connected to his community. He had dreams and ambitions, plans for the future that extended far beyond the borders of his hometown. Fernando was also deeply involved in a relationship with Nahir Mariana Galarza, a young woman 1 year his junior, whom he had been seeing for several years. Nahir, born on September 11, 1998, came from a prominent local family. Her father, Marcelo Galarza, was an officer with the provincial police, a position that commanded respect in the community. Her mother, Yamila Crow, was devoted to her daughter. Nahir herself was intelligent and ambitious, studying law at the Universidad de Concepción del Uruguay, while also playing field hockey. To the outside world, she appeared to be a bright young woman with every advantage: education, family support, athletic pursuits, and a promising future. But beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life, there were complexities and darkness that few people understood. The relationship between Nahir and Fernando had been intense from the beginning. They were young, passionate, and deeply intertwined in each other's lives in the way that first loves often are. But their relationship was also marked by volatility and conflict. Both claimed at various times that the other had been controlling, possessive, and violent. Nahir would later describe Fernando as jealous and aggressive, claiming he called her names, pulled her hair, and accused her of being with other men. However, Fernando's friends and family told a different story, describing Nahir as the one who was possessive and violent toward him. The truth of who was the aggressor and who was the victim in their relationship would become one of the central contested questions in the tragedy that was about to unfold. What was undeniable was that their relationship had been unstable, marked by breakups and reconciliations, by intense emotions that swung between love and anger. By late December 2017, they were no longer officially together, though they continued to maintain contact in the complicated way that former couples often do, unable to fully separate, but no longer functioning as a committed pair. The night of December 28th turning into the early morning of December 29th, 2017, would be the last night of Fernando Pastorizzo's life, though he had no way of knowing it as the evening began. At some point during those hours, Fernando and Nahir were together. The exact circumstances of how they came to be together that night would be disputed in the aftermath, with different versions of events emerging as the story unfolded. What is certain is that Fernando was driving his motorcycle, and at some point, Nahir was riding with him through the streets of Gualeguaychú. According to the reconstruction of events that investigators would later piece together, Nahir had obtained a firearm from her home, specifically a gun that belonged to her father, the police officer. How and why she took the weapon would become subjects of intense scrutiny. As Fernando drove his motorcycle through the Tomás de Rocamora neighborhood with Nahir either riding with him or nearby, something happened that escalated the situation from whatever conflict or conversation they were having into violence. The first gunshot rang out in the pre-dawn darkness. The bullet struck Fernando in the back as he sat on his motorcycle, the impact causing him to lose control of the vehicle. The motorcycle fell, and Fernando collapsed to the ground, wounded and vulnerable. For most people, seeing someone they once loved lying injured on the ground would trigger immediate action to help, to call for assistance, to do whatever possible to save that person's life. But Nahir did not call for help. She did not run to find someone who could assist. Instead, she approached Fernando as he lay on the ground and fired a second shot. This second bullet struck Fernando in the chest at a distance of approximately 50 centimeters, close enough that there could be no doubt about intent, no possibility of accident. The young man who had been her boyfriend, the person with whom she had shared intimate moments and made plans, lay dying on a street in the neighborhood where they had both grown up. His motorcycle was beside him, evidence that this had not been a robbery, as nothing was taken. There was simply Fernando, shot twice, bleeding out as the southern hemisphere summer dawn approached. After firing both shots, Nahir did something that would later be analyzed extensively by investigators, prosecutors, and the public trying to understand what had happened. She walked away from the scene. Security camera footage would later capture a figure matching Nahir's description walking through the streets around 5:22 in the morning, approximately 6 blocks from where Fernando lay dying. She walked about 20 blocks back to her home, covering the distance on foot, while Fernando remained on the ground beside his motorcycle. Nahir's family would later dispute that the person in the security footage was her, but prosecutors found the video compelling evidence that placed her at the scene during the crucial time frame. As she made her way home through the quiet pre-dawn streets, a nearby resident discovered Fernando's body. The alarm was raised and emergency services were called, but it was too late. Fernando Pastorizo died from his gunshot wounds, his life ending at just 20 years old on a street in his hometown, killed by bullets from a gun belonging to the father of the girl he had loved. The news of Fernando's death spread quickly through Gualeguaychú, a community small enough that violent death was shocking and rare. His family, his father Gustavo, his mother, his siblings, were devastated by the loss. They struggled to understand what had happened, who would want to kill Fernando, and why. The initial investigation focused on trying to identify who had been with him that night, who might have had a motive, and what had led to the shooting. As police investigated, they discovered the security camera footage showing the figure walking away from the area where Fernando was killed. They began interviewing people who knew Fernando, trying to piece together his movements in the hours before his death. Attention quickly turned to Nahir Galarza, who had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Fernando, and who investigators believed had been with him that night. When questioned by police, Nahir initially denied even being with Fernando on the night he died. She tried to distance herself from the crime, claiming she had nothing to do with it and had been elsewhere. But as evidence mounted and police continued to press, her story changed. In a development that shocked both her family and the broader community, Nahir admitted that she had been with Fernando that night and that she had shot him. However, she claimed that the shooting was accidental, that she never intended to kill him, and that what had happened was a tragic series of mistakes rather than murder. According to the version of events that Nahir presented to investigators and would later repeat during her trial, Fernando had come to her house on the night of December 28th. She claimed that he had been violent with her, grabbing her hair and hitting her. During this altercation, she said, Fernando had taken the gun belonging to her father. They had then gotten on his motorcycle together, with Fernando driving at a considerable speed. At one point, she claimed, they wobbled on a turn, and in the chaos of that moment, she managed to take the gun from Fernando's pocket where he had concealed it. The gun went off accidentally, she insisted, the first shot striking Fernando without her intending it. But her account did not stop there. She claimed that despite being shocked by what had happened, she had walked over to where Fernando had fallen to see how badly he was injured. And then, according to her story, the gun accidentally discharged a second time, firing the bullet that would ultimately kill Fernando. It was all a terrible accident, she maintained, a series of unintended events that had spiraled out of control and resulted in the death of her former boyfriend. Very few people believed this version of events. The ballistics expert from the Entre Rios police, Javier Azcue, examined the evidence and the circumstances of the shooting and came to a clear conclusion. In my years of experience, I have never seen or heard of any person shooting twice by accident, he testified. His expert opinion would prove devastating to Nahir's defense. He explained that while the first shot might possibly have been accidental, though even that seemed unlikely, the second shot, fired from a distance of 50 centimeters into Fernando's chest while he lay on the ground, could not possibly have been unintentional. The forensic evidence painted a picture of deliberate action rather than accident. Fernando had been shot once in the back while on or near his motorcycle, and then shot again in the chest at close range while lying on the ground. The physical evidence supported a scenario in which someone had shot him deliberately, approached his fallen body, and fired again to ensure he would not survive. It was an execution, not an accident. Nahir was arrested and charged with aggravated homicide, murder made more serious by the fact that she and Fernando had been in a stable romantic relationship. Under Argentine law, killing someone with whom you have been in a domestic partnership carries enhanced penalties, recognizing the particular betrayal and violation of trust involved when intimate partners commit violence against each other. Nahir was placed in preventive detention, held in custody while she awaited trial. The case became a media sensation in Argentina and eventually attracted international attention. A 19-year-old law student from a respectable family, the daughter of a police officer, had allegedly murdered her boyfriend in cold blood. The story had elements that captured public fascination: youth, beauty, violence, a disputed narrative about who was the aggressor and who was the victim in their relationship. Nahir's appearance, she was conventionally attractive, well-educated, and articulate, seemed to contradict the image many people held of what a murderer should look like, adding to the public's interest in the case. The trial began in July 2018, approximately 6 months after Fernando's death. The proceedings took place in Gualeguaychú, the same city where both Nahir and Fernando had grown up and where the crime had occurred. The courtroom was presided over by a panel of 3 judges: Mauricio Durruti, Arturo Duman, and Alicia Vivian. Nahir's defense team argued that the shooting had been accidental, that she had been a victim of domestic violence at Fernando's hands, and that any violence that occurred on December 29th had been in response to his aggression toward her. They presented her claim that Fernando had been controlling and abusive, that he had called her names and physically assaulted her. If the court accepted that she had been a victim of domestic violence, and that she had acted in response to immediate danger or threat, it could potentially reduce her culpability or lead to a lesser sentence. The defense strategy was clear: portray Nahir as someone who had been pushed to a breaking point by an abusive boyfriend, someone whose actions were defensive rather than aggressive. But the prosecution and Fernando's family painted an entirely different picture. They presented testimony from Fernando's friends who described instances of Nahir being violent toward him. They showed photographs of Fernando with a black eye from an incident just days before his death, injuries they attributed to Nahir and one of her friends. They argued that Nahir had been the possessive and controlling partner in the relationship, not Fernando. Most significantly, they emphasized that the physical evidence and forensic analysis completely undermined Nahir's claim that the shooting was accidental. One of the most damaging moments for Nahir during the trial came when she was questioned about her actions after the shooting. She was asked why she had not called an ambulance, why she had not sought help for Fernando, why she had simply walked away and left him dying on the street. Her answer shocked those in the courtroom. "Being injured does not mean that you are going to die," she said. The statement suggested a stunning lack of concern for Fernando's welfare, an apparent indifference to whether he lived or died that contradicted her claims that the shooting was accidental and that she cared about him. Even more damaging was testimony from one of Nahir's classmates, Julia Vieira, who recounted visiting Nahir in prison while she was awaiting trial. According to Vieira, she had asked Nahir a direct question: "Why did you kill him?" Nahir's response, as Vieira reported it, was chilling in its simplicity: "Because he was never going to leave me in peace." If this testimony was accurate, it represented a confession that the killing was intentional and motivated by a desire to be free of Fernando permanently. It directly contradicted everything Nahir had said about the shooting being accidental. The evidence mounted throughout the trial. Text messages between Nahir and Fernando were presented, offering insight into the dynamics of their relationship. Witness statements from friends and family members of both young people provided context about their interactions in the weeks and days before the murder. The ballistics expert's testimony definitively established that the shooting could not have been accidental, and the surveillance footage placed Nahir at the scene during the relevant time frame, regardless of her family's denials. On July 3, 2018, the panel of judges delivered their verdict. They found that the evidence overwhelmingly established Nahir's guilt. "These were intentional and aimed shots," the court stated as the verdict was read. The judges rejected the defense's arguments that the shooting was accidental and that Nahir had been acting in response to domestic violence. They found that there was no credible evidence Fernando had been abusive toward Nahir, and that the physical evidence proved the shots were deliberate acts meant to kill. Nahir Galarza was convicted of aggravated homicide and sentenced to life imprisonment. At 19 years old, she became the youngest woman in Argentina's history to receive such a sentence. Under the Argentine legal system, a life sentence means she must serve at least 35 years before becoming eligible for parole, meaning she would not be considered for release until approximately 2052, when she would be 54 years old. Nahir was not present in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Her absence was noted by those following the case, some viewing it as an inability to face the consequences of her actions. Her legal team immediately announced they would appeal the conviction, arguing that the sentence was too harsh and that the court had not properly considered the possibility of domestic violence or the defendant's youth. For Fernando's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never restore what they had lost. Gustavo Pastorizo, Fernando's father, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "The only winner here is justice," he said, his voice carrying both grief and satisfaction that his son's killer had been held accountable. "Today justice won. The truth won. Fernando is no longer with us, but he leaves a precedent. The verdict is a caress for my soul. I don't feel relieved, but I feel at peace. People know that it was a bloody murder against someone who couldn't defend themselves." His words captured the bittersweet nature of the verdict. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but no punishment could bring Fernando back or fill the void his death had created in their lives. A father had lost his son, siblings had lost their brother, and friends had lost someone they cared about, all because of 2 gunshots fired on a December morning in 2017. Nahir's defense team filed multiple appeals over the years that followed, each time arguing that the conviction should be overturned or the sentence reduced. In August 2019, an appellate court reviewed the case and rejected her appeal, confirming the life imprisonment sentence. In March 2020, the Supreme Justice Court of Entre Rios rejected another appeal. Most recently, in 2024, her legal team pursued further avenues for appeal, but these too were dismissed. The conviction and sentence have stood firm through every level of judicial review. Throughout her years in prison, Nahir has maintained her innocence at various times, though her claims have shifted over the years. She has told some people that the shooting was accidental, while reportedly confessing to others that it was intentional but necessary. She has pursued education while incarcerated, including studying psychology. Her mother has defended her publicly, insisting that her daughter is innocent and that the justice system failed to properly understand what happened that night. Today, Nahir Galarza remains imprisoned, serving her life sentence with decades still ahead of her before she might be considered for release. Fernando Pastorizo's family continues to grieve his loss, visiting his grave and keeping his memory alive. The city of Gualeguaychú still remembers the case that captured national attention, a tragedy that emerged from what should have been simply young love in a small Argentine city. The story of Fernando Pastorizo and Nahir Galarza is one without winners, only loss compounded by more loss. A young man died violently before his life truly began. A young woman will spend the prime of her life in prison for taking that life. 2 families were destroyed by choices made in the early morning hours of December 29, 2017. And a community was forced to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those we know most intimately, those we trust with our hearts and with whom we share our lives. Story 7. In the quiet, unassuming suburb of Deer Park, Texas, in the autumn of 1974, Ronald Clark O'Brien was the very picture of American respectability. At 30 years old, he was an optician, a deacon at his local Baptist church, the conductor of the church choir, and a devoted family man. He lived with his wife, Danine, and their 2 beautiful children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, in a modest home that was the embodiment of the suburban dream. To his neighbors and fellow churchgoers, Ronald O'Brien was a pillar of the community, a friendly, upstanding man who was always ready with a smile and a helping hand. But beneath this placid, carefully constructed facade, a different reality was festering. Ronald O'Brien was a man drowning in a sea of debt. He had held and lost 21 different jobs over the preceding decade, a pattern of instability that spoke to a deeper character flaw. By the fall of 1974, he was on the verge of financial ruin, owing more than $100,000, that is equivalent of over $500,000 today. He was about to lose his car, and foreclosure on his home was imminent. The pressure was immense, a vice that was squeezing the life out of his carefully maintained image. Ronald O'Brien was a desperate man, and desperate men, he was about to prove, are capable of the most monstrous of acts. In the months leading up to Halloween, a strange and sinister new interest had taken root in O'Brien's mind: cyanide. He began to ask questions, casual at first, then more persistent. He asked a chemist friend about the poison, how much it would take to kill someone. He approached a chemical supply salesman, inquiring about where he could purchase it. At the community college where he was taking classes, he peppered his professor with questions about the relative lethality of different poisons. He even tried to buy cyanide from 2 different chemical supply stores, leaving empty-handed only because the smallest amount available was more than he could afford or more than he needed. At the same time, O'Brien was quietly, methodically taking out life insurance policies on his children. In January, he had insured Timothy and Elizabeth for $10,000 each. Then, just a month before Halloween, he took out additional $20,000 policies on both of them. To his wife, Danine, he mentioned none of this. A plan was forming in the dark, secret corners of his mind, a monstrous solution to his financial woes. He was preparing to make a sacrifice, not on the altar of his faith, but on the altar of greed. Halloween night, 1974, fell on a Thursday. The air in Deer Park was warm and thick with the scent of burning leaves and the excited chatter of children. Ronald O'Brien, dressed in his everyday clothes, took Timothy and Elizabeth trick-or-treating. They were joined by a neighbor, Jim Bates, and his 2 children, Mark and Kimberly. The small group made their way through the familiar, decorated streets of their neighborhood, their plastic pumpkins and pillowcases slowly filling with candy. As the evening wore on, the group approached a house on a corner. The lights were out, the porch dark and unwelcoming. Jim Bates and the children, seeing no sign of life, moved on down the street. But Ronald O'Brien lingered behind in the shadows. A few minutes later, he caught up with the group, his arms laden with a strange prize: 5 giant, 22-inch pixie sticks, the powdered candy packaged in long plastic straws. He told the group that the residents of the dark house had cracked the door and showered him with candy. It was an odd story, but in the happy chaos of a Halloween night, no one gave it a second thought. He handed 1 pixie sticks to Timothy, 1 to Elizabeth, 1 to Mark, 1 to Kimberly, and the 5th to a 10-year-old boy he recognized from his church, Whitney Parker, who had joined the group a few houses back. Later that night, back at the O'Brien home, Timothy, tired from the excitement of the evening, was getting ready for bed. He asked if he could have 1 piece of candy before he went to sleep. Ronald, standing nearby, steered him towards the giant pixie sticks. It was the only treat he would have that night. Timothy perched on the edge of his bed, tore open the top of the plastic straw, and poured the sweet, colored powder into his mouth. Almost immediately, he complained that the candy tasted bitter. Ronald brought him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash the taste away. A moment later, Timothy staggered to the bathroom. He began to vomit violently, his small body convulsing in agonizing pain. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Timothy O'Brien was pronounced dead on arrival at the local hospital, less than an hour after he had eaten the Halloween candy. The dream of a quiet suburban life had just been shattered by an unimaginable nightmare. The news of Timothy O'Brien's death sent a wave of panic through the quiet community of Deer Park. A child had been poisoned by Halloween candy. It was the realization of a dark urban legend, a parent's worst nightmare made real. The police were immediately alerted to the existence of the other 4 giant pixie sticks that had been handed out by Ronald O'Brien. A frantic, late-night search began. The first call went to the Bates home. Jim Bates, woken by the police, found the 2 pixie sticks his children had received. They were still unopened. The next call went to the home of 10-year-old Whitney Parker. His parents found him in his bed, asleep, the pixie sticks in his hand. He had been trying to open it, but the staples that sealed the top of the plastic straw were too strong for his small fingers. He had given up and fallen asleep. That small, frustrating detail had saved his life. The final pixie sticks was in the O'Brien home. the one that had been intended for 5-year-old Elizabeth. She had not eaten it. All 4 of the remaining straws were rushed to a lab for analysis. The results were chilling. The top 2 inches of each straw had been filled not with candy, but with potassium cyanide, a dose large enough to kill 2 adults in each straw. The powdered candy had been carefully packed on top of the poison, and the plastic straws had been resealed with a staple. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of murder. The police investigation began with a single burning question. Who was the mad poisoner? The faceless monster who had handed out death from a darkened house. The entire community was gripped by fear. Parents across the Houston area were ordered to turn in all the candy their children had collected, a massive, unprecedented recall fueled by a citywide panic. The police were under immense pressure to find the killer. Their focus immediately turned to the man who had distributed the candy, Ronald O'Brien. He was the only person who had seen the mysterious resident of the dark house. The investigation, led by Pasadena Police Detective Mike Hinton, hinged on O'Brien's story. They asked him to retrace his steps, to take them to the house where he had received the poisoned candy. For days, O'Brien seemed to have a convenient and frustrating lapse of memory. He couldn't remember which house it was. Finally, after being pressed by the detectives, his memory was jogged. He pointed to a house on the corner, the home of a man named Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller at Houston's Hobby Airport. The police, believing they had their man, descended on the airport and arrested Melvin in front of his colleagues. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. But it wasn't. Courtney Melvin had a rock-solid alibi. On Halloween night, he had been at work until 11 p.m. Dozens of colleagues and official timesheets confirmed his story. His wife and daughter had been home, but they had turned out the lights early because they had run out of candy. They had not opened the door to anyone. Ronald O'Brien's story was a lie. The realization sent a chill down the spine of the investigators. The only person who could have put the poison in the candy was the man who had handed it out. The focus of the investigation shifted, with a sickening certainty, to the grieving father himself. As the investigators began to dig into Ronald O'Brien's life, the carefully constructed facade of the respectable family man began to crumble. They learned of his crushing debt, the 21 failed jobs, the imminent repossession of his car, and then they discovered the life insurance policies. A call to the insurance company revealed a chilling fact. At 9 a.m. on the morning after his son's death, before the autopsy had even been performed, Ronald O'Brien had called to inquire about collecting on Timothy's policy. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were beginning to fall into place. On November 5, 1974, just 5 days after Timothy's death, armed with a search warrant, detectives descended on the O'Brien home. They found a pair of scissors with a residue of plastic on the blades, consistent with the material of the pixie stick straws. In a drawer, they found a slip of paper, an adding machine tape on which O'Brien had meticulously tallied his debts. The total came to almost the exact amount of the insurance policies he stood to collect on the lives of his children. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a damning picture. They had the motive, greed. They had the means, access to cyanide, a fact later confirmed by the testimony of his professor and a chemical salesman. And they had the opportunity. He was the only person who had handled the candy before it was distributed. That same day, Ronald Clark O'Brien was arrested and charged with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The mad poisoner of the urban legends was not a faceless stranger. He was a father. The trial of Ronald Clark O'Brien, which began in Houston on May 5, 1975, was a national media sensation. The press dubbed him the Candy Man, a chilling moniker that would forever be associated with his terrible crime. O'Brien, who hired a legendary defense attorney, Marvin Teague, maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His defense was built on the very urban legend his crime had brought to terrifying life. The idea of a random, anonymous monster who poisoned Halloween candy. But the prosecution, led by the charismatic Vic Driscoll, methodically dismantled his defense. They presented the jury with the mountain of circumstantial evidence, The debt, the insurance policies, the inquiries about cyanide, the lie about the house on the corner. Friends and coworkers testified about O'Brien's unusual interest in cyanide in the months leading up to the murder. The most powerful testimony came from his own wife, Danine. Looking pale and emotionless, she took the stand and told the court that she had been unaware of the life insurance policies her husband had taken out on their children. She recounted his strange lack of emotion after Timothy's death, how he had pounded on the wall and asked why an 8-year-old had to die, but how she had not seen a single tear in his eyes. She also refuted a key detail of his story, stating that it was Ronald who had pushed the pixie sticks on Timothy, not the other way around. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of righteous fury. Vic Driscoll, pointing at the defendant, declared, "His whole life has been a lie. He has used his church. He has used his friends. He has used his community and his family. And worst of all, he has used his son, not as Abraham did. He sacrificed his son on the altar of greed." On June 3, 1975, after a trial that had gripped the nation, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned in just 46 minutes. The verdict was guilty on all counts. A little over an hour later, they delivered the sentence, death by lethal injection. Shortly after the conviction, Danine O'Brien filed for divorce. She would later remarry, and her new husband adopted her daughter, Elizabeth, giving her a new name and a chance at a new life, free from the shadow of the father who had tried to kill her. Ronald O'Brien was sent to death row, where he would spend the next 9 years appealing his sentence. On the night of his execution, March 31, 1984, a large, angry crowd gathered outside the prison walls in Huntsville, Texas. They shouted "Trick or treat," and showered the building with candy, a final, bitter condemnation of the man who had perverted a cherished childhood tradition. Inside, O'Brien's final statement was one of defiant, misplaced piety. "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong," he said. "However, we as human beings have to be accountable for our actions. I will be forgiven for this." His final words were a request for God's forgiveness for all of us. He was pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m. The crime of Ronald Clark O'Brien did more than just take the life of his own son. It poisoned a culture. He gave a terrifying, real-life face to a long-standing urban legend, and in doing so, he changed the way a generation of parents looked at Halloween. The open, trusting tradition of trick-or-treating was forever altered, replaced by a new reality of X-rayed candy, trunk-or-treat, events in church parking lots, and a lingering, background radiation of fear. The Candyman was gone, but the ghost of his crime would haunt the holiday for decades to come, a chilling reminder of the day a father's greed turned a child's sweet treat into a deadly instrument of murder.